The Great Exodus, an economic autopsy of the New Zealand dream. Paycheck but a healthier physical environment. Furthermore, the infrastructure deficit in New Zealand has reached a breaking point. With water pipes bursting in the capital and roads crumbling under the weight of neglect, a stark contrast to the massive infrastructure pipeline in Australia, where state governments, flush with mining royalties and stamp duty revenue, are building metro systems, tunnels, and hospitals at a pace that makes New Zealand look stagnant, creating an insatiable demand for tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, heavy diesel mechanics who are lured across the Tasman by salaries that allow them to buy boats and investment properties instead of struggling to pay the rent. This migration of the tradie class is particularly damaging because it hollows out the very workforce needed to fix New Zealand's housing shortage, creating a vicious cycle where the inability to build creates higher costs, which drives more workers away, which makes it harder to build. But perhaps the most critical turning point in this saga occurred in April 2023, when the Australian government, under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, announced a direct pathway to citizenship for New Zealanders living in Australia, a policy shift that dismantled the final psychological and practical barrier to migration, for previously, Kiwis in Australia were treated as second-class citizens, required to pay taxes but denied access to social safety nets like unemployment benefits or student loans, a risk that kept many risk-averse families at home. But with that barrier removed, the floodgates opened wide, allowing New Zealanders to move with the confidence that they and their children would be treated as equals, fully integrated into the Australian social contract. This policy change accelerated the brain drain to a terrifying velocity, particularly in the healthcare sector, where Australian recruiters now aggressively poach doctors, nurses, and radiographers from New Zealand hospitals, offering relocation packages, signing bonuses, and working conditions that the strained, underfunded New Zealand system simply cannot match, leaving those who remain to face burnout and understaffing in a collapsing system. Beyond the cold, hard numbers, there is a cultural dimension to this exodus, a quiet rejection of the tall poppy syndrome that permeates New Zealand society, a cultural tendency to cut down those who stand out or show too much ambition, which contrasts sharply with the more aggressive, aspirational, and hustle-friendly culture of Australia's big cities where success is celebrated rather than scrutinized, attracting the brightest young graduates who feel that their career ceilings in Auckland are too low and their ambitions too loud for a small pond. The isolation of New Zealand, once its greatest defense, has become its tyranny of distance in a connected world, where the cost of shipping goods and the time required to travel makes everything more expensive and less accessible, whereas Australia serves as a massive continental bridge with deeper connections to the Asian markets and a scale of economy that allows for specialization that simply cannot exist in a market of 5 million people. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that many who leave do not want to go. They leave with heavy hearts, missing their wano, the landscape, and the unique, gentle culture of Aotearoa. But they are forced out by the brutal arithmetic of modern survival, concluding that love for one's country cannot pay the power bill, and that the social contract in New Zealand, the promise that hard work will lead to a good life, has been broken. Ultimately, the Trans-Tasman exodus is a market signal that the New Zealand government ignores at its peril, a screaming red flag indicating that without a radical shift in policy regarding productivity, tax, housing, and competition, the nation risks becoming a hollowed-out scenic backdrop for tourists, while its economic engine and its future generations relocate permanently to the West Island, making Australia not just a neighbor, but the inevitable destination for the Kiwi Dream. The Great Exodus, an economic autopsy of the New Zealand dream. The story of the Great Trans-Tasman Exodus is not merely a tale of travel statistics or cyclical migration patterns, but rather a profound economic indictment of a structural failure that has been festering within the New Zealand economy for decades, creating a dynamic where the nation of Aotearoa is slowly transforming into a nursery and a retirement home, while donating its most productive demographic to its larger neighbor across the ditch. It begins not in the halls of Parliament in Wellington, but at the departure gates of Auckland International Airport, where every day families stand amidst tearful goodbyes and towering stacks of luggage, clutching one-way tickets that represent a vote of no confidence in their homeland's ability to provide a prosperous future. A scene that plays out with tragic regularity because the fundamental economic equation of life in New Zealand has broken down for the working class and the aspirational middle class alike. To understand why New Zealanders keep moving to Australia, one must look past the superficial beauty of the landscape and the marketing campaigns of 100% Pure to confront the brutal reality of the wage arbitrage, a phenomenon where a flight of fewer than 4 hours results in an immediate and life-changing increase in disposable income that no amount of patriotism can offset. For when a registered nurse or a police officer or a secondary school teacher compares their payslip in Christchurch to an equivalent role in Brisbane or Melbourne, they are not looking at a marginal difference of 5 or 10%, but a gaping chasm of 20 to 40% in base salary alone, a disparity that becomes even more grotesque when adjusted for purchasing power parity and the crushing tycoon tax that Kiwis pay on their daily existence. This wage gap is not an accident, but a symptom of the productivity paradox that plagues the New Zealand economy, a structural weakness driven by decades of capital shallowing where businesses, shielded by a lack of competition and a reliance on low-wage imported labor, have failed to invest in the machinery, technology, and automation required to boost output per hour worked, unlike in Australia where the mining boom and a larger domestic market have forced an accumulation of capital that drives wages up across the entire economy, creating a rising tide that lifts even the baristas and the retail assistants who have never set foot in a mine. The tragedy of the Kiwi worker is that they work harder and longer hours than almost anyone else in the OECD, yet they produce less value per hour simply because they are working with obsolete tools in a fragmented market, a frustration that boils over when they realize that their number 8 wire mentality, that celebrated cultural trait of making do with nothing, is actually a curse in the modern global economy because it excuses underinvestment and glorifies struggle over efficiency. While the wage gap is the pull factor, the push factor is a cost of living crisis that borders on the predatory, dominated by domestic duopolies that strangle the consumer, most notably in the supermarket sector where 2 major players control the food supply of an entire nation, allowing them to extract margins that would be illegal or impossible in more competitive markets like Australia, where giants like Aldi and Costco force prices down, leading to the perverse reality that New Zealanders, living in a country that produces enough food to feed 40 million people, pay some of the highest prices in the world for their own butter, cheese, and lamb, turning the weekly grocery shop into an exercise in financial anxiety. This financial assault continues into the housing market, which has become a speculative casino rather than a provider of shelter, fueled by tax policies that for years favored capital gains over productive income, driving house prices in Auckland and Wellington to multiples of income that rival New York or London, but without the corresponding high salaries, forcing young families to take on mortgages of $1 million for drafty, uninsulated wooden bungalows that would be condemned in other developed nations. Whereas in Australia, particularly in states like Queensland or Western Australia, that same level of debt secures a modern brick and tile home with double glazing, central cooling, and perhaps a swimming pool, fundamentally altering the standard of living from one of survival to one of comfort. The housing crisis is inextricably linked to the quality of life, for the damp home phenomenon in New Zealand is not just an aesthetic issue, but a public health emergency that contributes to high rates of asthma and respiratory illness, providing yet another reason for parents to pack their bags as they look at their coughing children and realize that the sun-drenched, dry climate of Perth or the Gold Coast offers not just a bigger paycheck,